My name is Edward Thompson. I am 32 years old and have been blind since I was 12. I was born in Liverpool, England, and have always dreamed of exploring the world through other senses. When we boarded the Titanic on that cold night in April 1912, I had no idea of the nightmare that awaited me. My hearing has always been my greatest ally. That night I noticed something strange in the sounds around me. The footsteps on the deck sounded different, more tense. The creaking of the wood had a frequency that made me uneasy. It was then that I met Heinrich, an apparently ordinary man who sat next to me in the dining hall. His movements were different. Something in his breathing didn't sound entirely human. He whispered something that sent chills down my spine. A spirit warned me, the ship will not reach its destination. At first I thought he was just another passenger trying to scare me, but there was something in his voice, a metallic, almost synthetic vibration that made me question his true nature. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to stay calm. Heinrich leaned closer and I could smell something strange. It wasn't human sweat. It was something chemical, almost metallic. "Something will come from the sea," he said, "something that will destroy everything." The other passengers continued their conversations, oblivious to the tension I felt. My other senses were on high, alert. The scent of polished wood mixed with expensive perfumes, but there was a different odor in the air, something reminiscent of ozone and burnt metal. As the night wore on, the tension increased. Heinrich remained by my side, his presence like a chilling shadow enveloping me. His fingers, when they accidentally brushed against my hand, felt different. Not soft like human skin, but something harder, almost like a metal alloy. "You're not human, are you?" I whispered. A piercing silence followed. Then he replied, "Not all travelers on this ship are what they seem." Suddenly I heard a deafening noise, a dull impact that made the ground tremble. My other senses picked up the panic around me, screams, rushing footsteps, metal bending against cold water. "The iceberg," Heinrich murmured, just as the spirit predicted. My blindness, which had always been a challenge, became almost a protection in that moment. I couldn't see the horror. I could only feel it through the terrifying sounds. Bodies, moving, water flooding the corridors, metal breaking like paper. Heinrich held my hand. His fingers didn't tremble, they felt no fear. It was like holding a metallic object programmed for a specific mission. "I need you to survive," he said. His voice had no emotion. It was like a command. The screams grew louder. People running, children crying, men shouting incomprehensible orders. The Titanic was breaking apart, and I, a blind passenger, was at the center of this nightmare. The icy water began to invade the space. My feet, initially dry, now felt the sharp liquid rising quickly. Heinrich remained by my side, his strange presence giving me a sense of supernatural protection. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "You won't die today." His voice had a metallic tone, almost computerized. The other passengers were running in panic, but he remained still, as if the situation didn't affect him at all. I heard the sounds of despair, wood breaking, torrents of water flooding the corridors, metal clashing. My blindness, which had always been a limitation, was almost a shield against the visual horror. "Who are you really?" I asked, feeling the cold liquid rising to my waist. Heinrich replied with a voice that didn't sound human. "An observer, a witness to a crucial moment in Earth's history." His fingers, when he held me, had a different temperature. They weren't warm or cold like humans, but something artificial, calculated. The ship continued to break apart. Each crack, each creak of metal was like a scream of agony. And I, in the midst of that chaos, held the hand of a being that was clearly not human. "Why are you protecting me?" I questioned. "Because your survival matters," was the only answer. The chaos was deafening, bodies falling, screams of terror, the metallic sound of the Titanic breaking into pieces. Heinrich pulled me with superhuman strength, moving through the crowd as if he knew every inch of the ship. "Hold my hand," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order. My blindness prevented me from seeing the horror, but my other senses were on high alert. I could smell the panic, sweat, fear, salt water mixed with machine oil and burning wood. Suddenly, Heinrich murmured something in a language I had never heard. It was strange, metallic sounds that seemed more like a code than words. Immediately, I felt something different, like an invisible energy enveloping us. "What's happening?" I asked. "Protection," he replied, emotionless. The water was cold, sharp. I knew that a few minutes at that temperature would mean certain death for any human. But Heinrich kept me close. His hand didn't tremble, felt no cold. I heard bodies falling into the water, screams turning into moans, then into silence. The Titanic was dying, and I was just a blind passenger in the midst of that nightmare. "You're not from here, are you?" I whispered. Heinrich didn't answer. He just held me with that superhuman strength. The last chat would reveal the deepest secrets of that tragic night. When the first rays of light began to brighten the horizon, I realized I was alive. Heinrich remained by my side, impassive, as a metallic statue. "We survived," he said without emotion. The sounds around us were of death and despair, bodies floating, driftwood, distant moans of people fighting against the extreme cold. My blindness at that moment was almost a comfort. I couldn't see the bodies, I could only feel them. Heinrich explained fragments of his true identity. He was not human, but an extraterrestrial observer sent to document crucial moments in Earth's history. The sinking of the Titanic was one of those points. "Why did you save me?" I asked. "You have a future role," he replied, enigmatically. His hands no longer seemed human. When he touched me, I felt a metallic, almost electronic texture, a being that observed, recorded, but did not feel. The rescue boats were approaching. Cries for help mixed with the sound of oars cutting through the cold water. Heinrich remained still, as if that chaos didn't affect him. "No one will believe my story," I murmured. He smiled, a smile that resembled an algorithm more than a human expression. "Exactly," he said. "My survival was a mystery. A blind man protected by a being that was not human, in the midst of the greatest maritime disaster in history. The Titanic was sinking. I was alive. And beside me, a being that observed the tragedy as if watching an experiment. The true horror was about to be revealed." When the last bodies were rescued, I noticed that Heinrich was no longer the same. His form began to change subtly, the skin fragmenting like a metallic shell, revealing something completely different underneath. "What are you really?" I asked, feeling a shiver run down my spine. He began to transform. He was neither human, nor something my mind could comprehend. Thin tentacles like steel wires began to sprout from his skin, moving like mechanical snakes. The smell was of ozone and blood. "I came to collect," said the creature. Suddenly, I understood. He was not a being that saved me. He was a predator choosing his prey. The other survivors began to mysteriously disappear, bodies vanishing without a trace. His eyes, once human, were now two black liquid spheres, reflecting nightmares that should not exist. Every movement he made was calculated like a perfect killing machine. "Collect what?" I managed to stammer. "Soul," replied the creature. The Titanic was just the beginning. I then realized I was trapped with a monster, a being that did not belong to this world, that had chosen that shipwreck as its hunting ground. The other survivors were merely bait, and I was the final trophy. The metallic tentacles began to wrap around me. They were neither warm nor cold, they were something between life and death. Each touch drained my memories, my essence. "No one will believe," I murmured. The creature laughed, a sound that was neither human nor animal. It was the sound of absolute emptiness. "Exactly," said Heinrich, or what was left of him. My last sensation was being pulled into a place between dimensions, where horror had no name, where the Titanic was merely a portal to something far more terrible. The scream I tried to let out was swallowed by a darkness that did not belong to this world.
My name is Edward Thompson, and I carry with me a secret that few would dare to believe. That night of April 14, 1912, was not just the sinking of a ship, but the beginning of a nightmare that would forever change my perception of humanity. I worked as a research assistant in the secret laboratory located in the bowels of the Titanic. We were a select group of scientists developing something that should never have come to light: an experimental virus, a mutation that turned humans into mindless creatures thirsty for flesh and blood. That fateful night, it all began with a simple accident. One of our researchers was bitten during an experiment. Within hours, chaos ensued. The first infected began attacking other crew members, spreading an infection that multiplied rapidly. The ship's corridors turned into a scene of horror: screams, blood, people running in desperation. But we were not just victims. We were part of a much larger and more sinister plan than anyone could imagine. When I realized the situation was completely out of control, I knew we needed a drastic solution. We couldn't allow that virus to reach land. We couldn't risk a mass contamination. It was then that a group of secret military personnel who had been monitoring our work made a radical decision to sink the Titanic. But it wouldn't be with an iceberg, as the official story claims. A specially prepared submarine awaited us nearby, ready to eliminate any trace of our research. I managed to escape in one of the last lifeboats, carrying with me some crucial samples. We were few survivors, and we all made a pact of silence. The world could never know the truth about what really happened that night. The days following the sinking were a nightmare of silence and conspiracy. Each survivor carried an immense weight, the secret that could change the course of world history. I remember clearly the moment the submarine approached the Titanic. It wasn't an ordinary submarine. It was a special biological containment unit equipped to destroy any trace of the zombie virus we had developed. The controlled explosions were precise. First, they eliminated the compartments where the experiments were conducted. Then, they destroyed any physical evidence of our research. The iceberg would be just a smokescreen to cover the true cause of the sinking. During the attack, I saw horrible creatures moving in the bowels of the ship. Infected individuals who were no longer human, but not entirely dead either. An intermediate state of existence that science should never have created. Our initial goal was to develop a virus that could create super-resistant soldiers. But something went terribly wrong. The mutation was faster and more aggressive than any of us could have predicted. The few survivors who knew the truth made a blood oath. We would be the guardians of this secret. Anyone who tried to reveal anything would be immediately silenced. The newspapers published the story of the iceberg. Families mourned their dead. But we knew the truth behind that tragedy. Years later, we continued monitoring possible mutations. Those samples I saved are our only record of what truly happened that fateful night. The world is not ready to know that the Titanic was much more than a ship. It was the first testing ground for a biological weapon that could have forever changed the concept of war. The truth about the Titanic is more complex than anyone could imagine. Our secret laboratory was not just an isolated project, but part of an international network of experimental research that pushed the boundaries of ethics and morality. I remember the faces of my fellow scientists. Brilliant men and women, but completely dehumanized in their quest for absolute knowledge. We were funded by governments and secret organizations that saw the zombie virus as a potential revolutionary weapon. The first symptoms of the infection were subtle. It began with an almost imperceptible behavioral change. Increased aggression, gradual loss of higher cognitive functions, an inexplicable thirst for human flesh. Our initial tests were conducted on prisoners and marginalized individuals, people no one would miss. By the time of the sinking, we had already lost control. About 40% of the crew was infected, slowly transforming into creatures that defied any scientific understanding. The submarine that followed us wasn't just a unit of destruction, but also of containment. I managed to save 3 vials of the virus. They were hidden in a special compartment in my jacket. Each vial represented a different variation of the mutation, each one more dangerous than the last. The military personnel accompanying us knew we couldn't allow any trace of the virus to escape. That's why the sinking was so meticulously planned. An iceberg would be the perfect excuse, an apparently natural accident that would cover our tracks. My fellow researchers were sacrificed without hesitation. We were just pawns in a much larger game, where human lives were nothing more than numbers in a secret report. After the sinking, I was relocated. My identity was completely altered. Edward Thompson ceased to exist officially, becoming just another ghost carrying a secret that could destroy humanity. The samples I saved remain with me. I await the right moment to reveal them, or to destroy them forever. The years following the Titanic were a labyrinth of secrets and paranoia. Every move I made was carefully monitored. I knew I wasn't completely free from those who watched me. The scars from that night weren't just physical, but deeply psychological. Nightmares haunted me constantly. Images of bodies transforming, screams echoing in the ship's corridors, the smell of blood and decay mixed with machine oil. Our secret laboratory had international branches. England, Germany, the United States all were involved in this macabre project of genetic manipulation. The Titanic was just one of many experiments, perhaps the most ambitious. I later discovered that some of the virus samples were preserved in secret facilities. We weren't the only ones developing this biological weapon. Governments around the world were competing to create the ultimate weapon, a virus that could turn soldiers into mindless destruction machines. The survivors who knew the truth formed a kind of silent brotherhood. Discreet meetings, coded communications. Some were bought with fortunes, others threatened with death. Silence was our only protection. My family never knew what really happened. To them, I was just another passenger who miraculously survived that tragic night. How many times did I look into their eyes, wishing I could tell the truth? The 3 vials of the virus I saved are my greatest secret. They are hidden in a place no one will ever find. They are my testimony, my proof that something far beyond a simple sinking happened that night. With each passing year, I feel the truth is closer to being revealed. But I also know that revealing this secret could mean my death sentence. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a floating laboratory, a scientific experiment that went terribly wrong. The last chapter of my story is the hardest to share. Decades have passed, and the weight of the secret continues to consume me. In 1945, after the end of World War II, I discovered that some of our experiments were taken to Nazi laboratories. The zombie virus we developed on the Titanic had become a project of interest for scientists who would stop at nothing to create biological weapons. My secret contacts informed me that fragments of the original samples were used in experiments. In concentration camps, prisoners were test subjects for increasingly complex mutations of the virus. Human cruelty knew no bounds. In the 1960s, I realized I was being followed. Men in dark suits, penetrating stares, always close but never fully approaching. I knew my existence represented a risk to those who wanted to keep the secret buried in the depths of the Atlantic. My only protection was the 3 vials. They contained not only the original virus, but also detailed notes on our research. Should anything happen to me, I left instructions for part of this information to be revealed. The world believes the Titanic was a tragedy caused by an iceberg. How naive. We were part of a much larger project, an international conspiracy to develop the ultimate weapon, a virus capable of turning humans into destruction machines. Today, in my final years of life, I feel I must leave some record, not for glory, but as a warning. Science without ethics can become humanity's greatest nightmare. The few survivors who knew the truth have passed. I am the last guardian of this terrible secret that could completely change the history we know. The Titanic was much more than a ship. It was the beginning of something that should never have started. My time is near. I feel the same men who pursued me for decades are getting closer. My final act will be to reveal the absolute truth. The 3 vials I've guarded for so long will be my last message to the world. Inside them is not just the virus, but the definitive proof of a conspiracy that spanned generations. On the night before my 95th birthday, I decided to prepare my final testimony. I write these words knowing I probably won't see the dawn. I hear footsteps in the hallway. They are coming. The Titanic virus was just the first step in a much more complex plan. A project that began in 1912 and continued through wars, secret experiments, and government manipulations. I've left 3 sealed envelopes with my lawyer. Should anything happen to me, the truth will be revealed. Documents, samples, records that prove everything I've narrated. The world will finally know what really happened that fateful night. My final thoughts are of terror and hope. Terror at what humanity is capable of creating. Hope that this story may prevent future inhumane experiments. The Titanic was just the beginning. A floating laboratory that carried the germ of possible worldwide destruction. And I, Edward Thompson, was a silent witness to this story for nearly a century. I hear the door opening. They've arrived. Will the truth die with me? No. My documents will ensure the world knows. Goodbye, Edward Thompson, last survivor of the Titanic's secret laboratory.
It was a cold and dark night in the middle of the North Atlantic. The Titanic, the most luxurious and majestic ship ever built, cut through the icy waters with a confidence that seemed to defy the ocean itself. I, as one of the ship's officers, was making my nightly rounds on the deck, ensuring everything was in order. The sky was starry, but there was a strange feeling in the air as if something was about to happen. As I walked near the bow, I saw a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was an insomniac passenger, but as I approached, I realized something was wrong. The figure was tall, much taller than an ordinary human, and its silhouette seemed distorted, as if out of focus. My heart raced, but I knew I couldn't show fear. It was my duty to remain calm. "Sir, the deck is closed to passengers at this hour. You should be in your cabin," I said, trying to sound firm. The figure turned slowly, and that's when I saw its face. Or rather, the lack of it. Where there should have been a face, there was only a glowing mist, as if I were staring into the void of space. My knees weakened, but I stood my ground. "You shouldn't be here," whispered a voice that echoed in my mind, not in my ears. It was a strange voice, as if composed of thousands of whispers at once. "This ship is doomed." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The ice. It's lurking. They won't listen. But you must warn them. Time is running out." Before I could respond, the figure began to dissipate, like smoke in the wind. In a matter of seconds, there was nothing. There, just the biting cold of the night. I stood still, trying to process what had just happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? But the sense of urgency that being had conveyed was too real to ignore. I decided I needed to warn Captain Smith. Even if he didn't believe me, I had to try. The Titanic couldn't sink. It just couldn't. I ran toward the bridge, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of that ethereal figure was still etched in my mind, and its words echoed like a funeral bell. When I arrived, Captain Smith was there, calmly talking to the first officer, Murdoch. Both seemed at ease, completely unaware of the danger approaching. "Captain, I need to speak with you. It's urgent," I said, trying to control my breathing. Smith turned to me with a look of surprise. "What's happened, officer? You seem disturbed." I saw something on the deck. Something I can't explain. A figure, an entity. It told me the ship is doomed, that there's ice lurking, and that time is running out." Murdoch chuckled softly, but the captain remained serious. "Officer, you're under a lot of pressure. It's understandable. But we can't act on visions or premonitions. We have procedures to follow." "But, Captain, I swear it wasn't a hallucination. It was real. We need to change course, reduce speed. Something terrible is going to happen." Smith placed a hand on my shoulder as if trying to calm me. "I appreciate your concern, but the Titanic is unsinkable. Besides, we're in safe waters. There's no reason for panic." I wanted to scream, to insist, but I knew it would be futile. The hierarchy on board was clear, and I had already overstepped my bounds. With a lump in my throat, I left the bridge, feeling powerless. As I walked back to the deck, I looked out at the sea. The water was calm, almost like a mirror, reflecting the stars above. But there was something about that calmness that unsettled me, as if the ocean was just waiting for the right moment to show its true face. Hours passed, and the Titanic continued its journey, cutting through the icy waters with the same imposing speed. I was at my post, trying to focus on routine tasks, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. That warning, that figure, it all seemed so real, but no one believed me. Then I felt it. A slight tremor, almost imperceptible, that ran through the ship. My heart stopped for a moment. I knew what it meant. I ran to the side of the deck and looked out at the water. There it was, a dark and imposing mass, an iceberg. The impact was followed by a horrible sound, as if the Titanic's hull was being torn apart by invisible claws. Screams began to echo across the ship, and the calm of the night was replaced by chaos. Passengers in pajamas ran desperately, while the crew tried to maintain order. "Everyone to the lifeboats, stay calm," I heard someone shout, but the order seemed lost in the panic. I knew what I had to do. I ran to help evacuate the passengers, but deep down, I knew there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. That ship, which was considered unsinkable, was doomed. As I helped a family into one of the lifeboats, I looked up at the sky. The stars still shone, but now they seemed indifferent to our fate. That's when I saw it again. That figure, the entity that had warned me. It was there, floating above the deck, watching everything with a disturbing serenity. "I warned you," the voice whispered in my mind, "but they didn't listen." "Why didn't you do more?" I shouted, my voice lost in the chaos. "I did what I could. Now it's up to you." And just like before, the figure began to dissipate, leaving behind only the cold and despair. The Titanic began to tilt slowly, and I knew the end was near. The icy water already covered part of the deck, and the passengers' screams were deafening. I looked out at the sea, at the ocean that would now be our grave, and felt a deep sadness. Everything could have been different if they had listened to me. The Titanic continued to tilt, and the icy water advanced relentlessly. The chaos was indescribable. Passengers ran in all directions, some trying to reach the lifeboats, others simply paralyzed by fear. The air was filled with screams, cries, and the distant sound of metal groaning under the pressure of the water. I was helping a woman and her child into one of the last lifeboats when I heard a desperate cry behind me. It was an elderly man, clinging to a railing, trying to stand as the water rose rapidly around him. I ran toward him, but before I could reach him, a freezing wave dragged him into the sea. His panicked face disappeared into the dark waters, and I knew there was nothing I could do. "Everyone to the lifeboats, women and children first," I heard someone shout, but the order already seemed useless. The lifeboats were almost all full, and there were still hundreds of people on board. That's when I remembered the figure, the entity that had warned me. It appeared again, floating above the deck, watching the chaos with an expression I couldn't decipher. Was it sadness? Indifference? I didn't know, but its presence gave me a strange sense of calm. "You did what you could," the voice whispered in my mind. "Now it's time to save yourself." "I can't abandon them," I shouted, but the figure was already dissipating, leaving me alone with my decisions. I looked around. The water already covered much of the deck, and the ship was tilted at a frightening angle. I knew there wasn't much time. I ran toward one of the last lifeboats, but before I could reach it, a freezing wave hit me, throwing me against a metal wall. The pain was intense, but I knew I couldn't stop. With a superhuman effort, I got up and continued to fight against the water, trying to reach the lifeboat. When I finally got there, I saw it was almost full. There was only one spot left. "Get in!" shouted one of the crew members, reaching out to me. I looked back at the sinking ship and the people still there, fighting for their lives. I knew that if I got into that lifeboat, I'd be condemning others to death, but I also knew that if I didn't, I would die. I hesitated for a moment, looking at the lifeboat and the rapidly sinking ship. The icy water was already covering my ankles, and the cold was unbearable. I knew I didn't have much time. Finally, I made my decision. I jumped into the lifeboat, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. "Row! Row fast!" shouted the crew member, and everyone began to row with all their might, trying to get away from the Titanic before it was completely swallowed by the ocean. I looked back at the ship, which was now almost completely submerged. The lights still shone, but they were fading quickly. Screams and cries echoed through the air, and the sound of groaning metal was deafening. Then, the Titanic began to sink, faster, the bow plunging into the icy waters while the stern rose into the air like a wounded giant. It was a horrifying sight, something I would never forget. The ship that was considered unsinkable was disappearing before my eyes, taking hundreds of lives with it. I felt a deep pain in my chest, a mix of sadness, guilt, and despair. "You did what you could," I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself there was no other choice. But the guilt was still there, weighing like a stone on my heart. The lifeboat continued to drift away, and soon the Titanic disappeared completely, leaving only debris and bodies floating in the icy water. The silence that followed was almost worse than the chaos. Everyone in the lifeboat was in shock, unable to believe what had happened. That's when I saw it again. The figure, the entity that had warned me. It was there, floating above the water, watching everything with an expression I couldn't decipher. "Why did you do this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I warned you, but they didn't listen. Now, it's up to you. Will you learn from this, or will you repeat the same mistakes?" Before I could respond, the figure began to dissipate, leaving behind only the cold and silence. I stared at the spot where it had been, trying to process everything that had happened. I knew that night would change my life forever. The Titanic had sunk, but the warning from that entity still echoed in my mind. Would we learn from this, or would we continue to make the same mistakes, trusting too much in our technology and arrogance? The lifeboat continued to drift in the darkness, carrying the survivors to an uncertain future. But for me, that night would always be a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of heeding warnings, even when they come from sources we cannot understand.
It was a cold and dark night, April 15th, 1912. The couple, Thomas and Margaret, had boarded the Titanic with their 8-year-old son, Samuel, filled with hope and dreams of a new life in America. The ship was a colossus of luxury and technology, and no one could have imagined that this would be the last day for so many lives. When the ship collided with the iceberg, chaos ensued. Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel were in their quarters when the impact occurred. The metallic noise and the tremor that followed were enough to wake Samuel, who began to cry. Thomas, trying to stay calm, told his family that everything would be fine. But the fear in his eyes was undeniable. As the ship began to tilt, the couple decided to head for the lifeboats. The corridor was filled with desperate people, screaming and running in all directions. Margaret held Samuel tightly, while Thomas tried to make way. The biting cold of the North Atlantic night air was unbearable, and the sound of people falling into the icy water echoed in the distance. When they finally reached the deck, the scene was one of pure horror. People were fighting for a place in the lifeboats, while others were already in the water, trying to swim in vain. The couple managed to get into one of the last lifeboats, but what they saw from there would haunt them forever. As the Titanic sank, illuminated by the lights that still worked, the sea around it was filled with bodies. People who had jumped or fallen from the ship now floated lifelessly, their clothes soaked and their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Samuel, still in shock, asked his mother why those people weren't moving. Margaret, with tears in her eyes, didn't know what to say. The silence that followed the sinking was almost worse than the screams. The lifeboat floated in a sea of death, surrounded by bodies that swayed gently with the waves. Thomas tried to cover Samuel's eyes, but the boy had already seen too much. The couple embraced, trying to find comfort in each other, but the weight of that night was unbearable. When the rescue finally arrived, the sun was beginning to rise, illuminating the scene of destruction. The couple and their son were taken aboard the Carpathia, but the trauma remained. Samuel was never the same, often waking up from nightmares where he saw the faces of those who had died that night. Thomas and Margaret tried to move on, but the memory of those bodies floating in the icy sea never left them. Years later, the couple still wondered how they had survived when so many others had not. The Titanic had sunk, but the nightmare they had lived through remained alive in their minds, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the horror they had witnessed on that fateful night. The years that followed the Titanic disaster were marked by a heavy silence in the home of Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel. The couple tried to rebuild their lives, but the trauma of that night was like a shadow that never left them. Samuel, now a teenager, carried a deep melancholy within him. He rarely spoke about what he had seen, but his eyes, once full of innocence, now reflected a void that seemed endless. Thomas, who had once been a cheerful man full of stories to tell, had become reserved and distant. He spent hours staring at the sea, as if hoping to find answers in the waves that crashed on the shore. Margaret, on the other hand, tried to keep the family together, but she herself struggled with the nightmares that haunted her every night. In her dreams, she saw the bodies floating in the icy sea, and she would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. The couple tried to move away from the sea, hoping that distance might help them forget, but the ocean seemed to be everywhere, in every sound, in every breeze that passed through the window. Samuel began to take an interest in drawing, and often he would sketch dark figures of people falling from a giant ship. Thomas and Margaret tried not to comment, but they knew their son was trying to process the trauma in his own way. One night, many years after the disaster, Thomas decided to tell Samuel the full story of what had happened. He spoke about the luxury of the Titanic, about the people they had met on board, and about the moment everything fell apart. Margaret held her son's hand as Thomas described the chaos, the screams, and the bodies floating in the sea. Samuel listened in silence, his tears streaming silently down his face. "Why did we survive, Dad?" Samuel asked, his voice trembling. Thomas looked at his son, his own eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, son, but we have to honor those who weren't as lucky. We have to live for them." From that day on, the family began to find a way to cope with the past. They visited Titanic memorials, spoke with other survivors, and even wrote their own stories. Samuel, now an adult, became a historian, dedicating his life to preserving the memory of those who had lost their lives that fateful night. But even with time, the nightmare never completely disappeared. On cold, dark nights, when the wind blew hard, Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel could still hear the echoes of the screams and see the faces of those who had not survived. The Titanic had sunk, but the legacy of horror it left behind remained alive, a constant reminder that, even in stories of survival, there is a price to pay. And so, the couple and their son moved forward, carrying the weight of that night, but also the determination to honor those who were lost. The Titanic may have sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations. As the years passed, the family tried to find meaning in the tragedy. They had survived. Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel had moved to a small town inland, far from the sea, hoping that the tranquility of the countryside might bring some relief. But the past always found a way to intrude on their lives. Samuel, now a young adult, had married and had a son whom he named Thomas after his grandfather. He tried to shield his son from the dark stories that haunted the family. But the boy, curious and perceptive, began to ask questions about the distant grandfather and the grandmother who always seemed sad. One night, during a family gathering, young Thomas found an old wooden box in the attic. Inside were faded photographs, letters, and a diary that had belonged to Margaret. The boy brought the box to the living room where the family was gathered. When Samuel saw the contents, his face paled. "What is this, Dad?" asked young Thomas, holding a photo of the Titanic before it departed. Samuel took a deep breath and decided it was time to tell the full story. He began to speak about the ship, about the people they had met, and about the night everything changed. Margaret, now elderly, sat beside her grandson, holding his hand as Samuel described the horror they had witnessed. Young Thomas listened, intently, his eyes filled with tears. "Why did you never tell me this before?" he asked. Margaret looked at her grandson with a sad smile. "We wanted to protect you, my dear, but perhaps it's important that you know, so that we never forget those who are gone." From that day on, the family began to share their stories more openly. They visited museums, attended Titanic memorial events, and even wrote a book about their experiences. Young Thomas, now a teenager, became an advocate for historical preservation, dedicating himself to ensuring that the lessons of the Titanic would never be forgotten. But even with time, the past continued to haunt them. On stormy nights, when the wind howled and the rain beat against the windows, the family could still hear the echoes of the screams and see the faces of those who had not survived. The Titanic had sunk, but the legacy of horror it left behind remained alive. A constant reminder that, even in stories of survival, there is a price to pay. And so, the family moved forward, carrying the weight of that night, but also the determination to honor those who were lost. The Titanic may have sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations, reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. Years passed, and Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel grew older, but the weight of that night never left them. Young Thomas, now a grown man, had become a renowned historian, dedicating his life to preserving the memory of the Titanic and the lives that were lost. He traveled the world, giving lectures and writing books, always with the goal of ensuring that the tragedy would never be forgotten. But even with all his success, the past continued to haunt him. On his travels, he always avoided cruises and large ships, preferring to fly or travel by land. The sea, once a symbol of adventure and freedom, was now a constant reminder of the horror his family had witnessed. One day, Thomas received an invitation to attend a special memorial ceremony for the Titanic, to be held at the exact location where the ship had sunk. He hesitated, but he knew it was important to be there. He invited his father, Samuel, now in a wheelchair, and his mother, Margaret, who was frail but still full of determination. The journey was difficult, but the family was determined to honor those who had lost their lives that fateful night. When they arrived at the location, the sea was calm and the sky was clear. The ceremony was emotional, with speeches, music, and a special tribute to the survivors and victims. At the end of the ceremony, Thomas was invited to say a few words. He stepped onto the stage, looked at the crowd, and began to speak. He told the story of his family, of the fear, the loss, and the survival. He spoke of the bodies floating in the sea, of the screams that echoed in the night, and of the silence that followed. He spoke of the weight of carrying that memory, and of the importance of never forgetting. When he finished, the crowd was silent, moved by Thomas's words. He stepped down from the stage and joined his family, who embraced him tightly. They knew this would be the last time they would be together at the place where it had all happened. But they also knew that the legacy of the Titanic would continue to live on through them and through all those who heard their stories. That night, as the sun set on the horizon, the family looked out at the sea, now calm and serene. They knew the past would never completely leave them, but they also knew they had done their best to honor those who were lost. The Titanic had sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations, reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. And so, the family moved forward, carrying the weight of that night, but also the determination to honor those who were lost. The Titanic may have sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations, reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. As the years went by, the family's story became a symbol of resilience and remembrance. Thomas, the grandson, continued his mission to preserve the memory of the Titanic, but he also began to explore the psychological impact the disaster had on survivors and their families. He published a deeply personal book titled Echoes of the Titanic: Survival and Trauma, which became a bestseller and was translated into several languages. The book not only told the story of his family, but also explored the invisible scars that trauma left on generations of survivors. Meanwhile, Samuel, now an elderly man, spent his days in a rocking chair, gazing at the horizon. He rarely spoke of the Titanic, but when he did, his words were laden with a mix of pain and gratitude. He knew his survival was a miracle, but he also understood that the price paid for that survival was something he would carry forever. Margaret, the family matriarch, passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92. On her deathbed, she held Samuel's hand and whispered, "We honored them, my love. We honored them." Her last words were a testament to her strength and the love she had devoted to her family and the memory of those who had not survived. After Margaret's death, Samuel decided it was time to close a chapter of his life. He donated all the family's Titanic-related artifacts to a museum dedicated to the ship, including Margaret's diary, the photographs, and even the original boarding pass. He knew these relics belonged to the world and that their story needed to be told for future generations. Thomas, now a middle-aged man, continued to work tirelessly to ensure the memory of the Titanic would never be forgotten. He founded a non-profit organization called Echoes of the Titanic, which supported historical research, artifact preservation, and educational programs about the disaster. The organization also offered psychological support for descendants of survivors, recognizing that trauma could be passed down through generations. On a cold winter night, Thomas decided to visit the site where the Titanic had sunk, this time alone. He boarded a research vessel, and when he reached the exact location, he gazed into the dark, deep waters. He felt a profound connection to the past, as if the spirits of those who had lost their lives were there, watching him. He tossed a wreath of flowers into the sea in honor of the victims and whispered, "We remember you. Your stories will never be forgotten." As the ship returned to shore, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew the legacy of the Titanic would continue to live on, not just through his family, but through all those who heard the stories and learned from them. And so, the family moved forward, carrying the weight of that night, but also the determination to honor those who were lost. The Titanic had sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations, reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. The Titanic may have disappeared into the depths of the ocean, but its legacy remains alive, an eternal testament to human strength, resilience, and the ability to overcome even the most terrible nightmares.
It was a cold, starry night, April 14th, 1912. The Titanic, the most luxurious and supposedly unsinkable ship, was cutting through the icy waters of the North Atlantic. My wife, Margaret, and I were on the deck, enjoying the fresh air before retiring to our quarters. Margaret, at 68, had always been a woman of faith, but I, at 70, was more skeptical. Still, that night, something strange happened that would change my perspective forever. As we walked along the deck, Margaret suddenly stopped and grabbed my arm tightly. Her eyes were fixed on something ahead of us. "James, do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I followed her gaze and saw a vague, almost translucent figure standing near the railing. It was a man, dressed in dirty, torn work clothes. He seemed to be trying to speak, but no sound came from his mouth. His eyes, however, conveyed a desperate urgency. "Margaret, let's get out of here," I said, trying to pull her away. But she didn't move. "He's trying to warn us, James. Something terrible is going to happen." Before I could respond, the figure vanished, leaving only a chill in the air. Margaret was convinced we had seen a spirit, but I was still trying to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps it was just fatigue. or maybe an illusion caused by the moonlight. That night, as we prepared for bed, Margaret seemed restless. James, that man, he was trying to warn us about the ship. We need to stay alert. I tried to calm her, but deep down, a sense of unease began to settle in me. What exactly had we seen? And why did that figure seem so distressed? The next morning, April 15th, the atmosphere on the Titanic seemed normal. Passengers were enjoying breakfast, and the crew was going about their routines. But Margaret and I were disturbed. During the night, she had a vivid dream in which the same man we saw on the deck appeared, trying to scream something, but to no avail. He was pointing to the sea, James. To the ice, she told me, her face pale with worry. We decided to spend the morning on the deck, watching the horizon. The sky was clear, but the air was cold, colder than usual. Around noon, something strange happened again. This time, it wasn't just one figure, but several. They were scattered across the deck, all dressed like workers, with tools in their hands. Some seemed to be hammering the air, others tried to speak, but, as before, no sound was emitted. The passengers around us seemed oblivious, but Margaret and I were paralyzed. "James, they are trying to warn us," Margaret whispered, gripping my arm tightly. "The ship, something is wrong with the ship." I felt a chill run down my spine. Those figures, whoever they were, seemed desperate. But what could we do? The crew wouldn't take us seriously if we said we were seeing spirits. As the day went on, the feeling of unease only grew. Around 11:40 p.m., we were in our quarters when we felt a strong tremor. The ship had collided with something. Margaret looked at me, her eyes filled with terror. They were right, James. The ship is going to sink. The impact was followed by a haunting silence, soon broken by screams and hurried footsteps in the corridors. Margaret and I looked at each other, knowing that the worst had happened. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to stay calm, but my voice trembled. We grabbed our coats and went out onto the deck, where chaos was already beginning to unfold. As we walked, I saw the figures of the workers again. This time, there were more of them, and their expressions were of absolute despair. One of them, an older man with a disheveled beard, tried to approach me, gesturing frantically. He pointed to the lifeboats, but, as before, he couldn't make any sound. Margaret grabbed my hand. "They are trying to help us, James. We need to follow what they are indicating." The crew began organizing the evacuation, but it was already evident that there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Margaret and I headed toward one of the boats, but we were stopped by an officer. "Sir, women and children first," he said, with a stern expression. Margaret looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "James, you need to save yourself," she whispered. I refused to leave her. "I won't abandon you, Margaret. We'll find another way." As we searched for another boat, I saw the figures of the workers again. They were now around the lifeboats, as if trying to protect the passengers. One of them, the same older man, pointed to a boat that was being lowered. "There, James," Margaret shouted, pulling my hand. We ran toward the boat, and this time the officer allowed us to board. As the lifeboat was lowered into the icy waters, I looked back at the Titanic. The lights were still on, but the ship was already beginning to tilt. The figures of the workers were now on the deck, watching the chaos with expressions of sadness. They had tried to warn us, but no one had heard them. As the lifeboat drifted away from the Titanic, the cold air cut like a knife. Margaret was by my side, shivering but alive. We looked at the ship, which was now clearly tilted, with the lights flickering as if in agony. The sound of screams and cries echoed across the water, a sound I would never forget. Suddenly, Margaret squeezed my arm. "James, look, she whispered, pointing to the deck of the Titanic. There they were again, the figures of the workers. This time, they were lined up, as if paying a final tribute to the ship they had built. The older man, who seemed to be the leader, looked directly at us. He raised his hand in a gesture of farewell, and then, slowly, all the figures began to disappear, one by one, until none were left. Margaret began to cry. They were trying to save us, James. They knew this was going to happen. I held her close, trying to comfort her, but I also felt a deep sadness. Those men, whoever they were, had given their lives to build the Titanic, and now, in their death, they had tried to save the passengers, but no one had heard them. The Titanic continued to sink, and soon the lights went out completely. The ship vanished into the dark waters, taking with it over 1,500 souls. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret and I clung to each other, knowing we had survived by a miracle, but also knowing that many others had not been so fortunate. After being rescued by the RMS Carpathia, Margaret and I spent days in shock. The memories of the sinking and the figures that tried to warn us haunted us. Margaret, in particular, was convinced that those spirits were the workers who had built the Titanic. They knew the ship wasn't safe, James. They tried to warn us, but no one listened, she would say, her voice filled with sorrow. When we arrived in New York, we were interviewed by reporters seeking accounts of the disaster. Margaret bravely recounted the figures we had seen. They were there, trying to warn us. They were the spirits of those who built the ship. They knew the Titanic was doomed. The reporters looked at her skeptically, but Margaret didn't care. She knew what she had seen. In the years that followed, Margaret and I became advocates for maritime safety. We participated in commissions that investigated the sinking and fought for stricter regulations in shipbuilding. Margaret always said we were honoring the memory of those spirits who had tried to save us. Margaret passed away in 1920, but until the end of her days, she never doubted what we had seen that fateful night. I, for my part, continued to tell our story, hoping that the lessons of the Titanic would never be forgotten. Those spirits, whoever they were, gave us a warning that changed our lives. And although the Titanic sank, its message of alertness remains alive. An eternal reminder of the importance of listening to those who try to warn us, even if their voices cannot be heard.
How does one survive the unspeakable and still carry the weight of the dead? I often find myself staring at the ocean, its surface calm and inviting, while my mind churns with memories of that fateful night aboard the Titanic. My name is Samuel O'Reilly, a first-class steward who once served the elite of the world, and I am not here to recount the ship's grandeur or the elegance of its passengers. No, I intend to share the horror that lurked beneath the surface, a horror that clings to me still like the salt of the Atlantic. It was April 10, 1912, when I boarded the Titanic in Southampton, my heart racing with anticipation. The ship was a floating palace, its opulence a stark contrast to the grimy streets of my childhood in the docks of Cove, Ireland. I had spent my early years dreaming of a life beyond the rusted ships and the constant smell of fish, and now I was part of something magnificent. As I walked through the grand halls, adorned with gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, I felt like I had finally escaped my past. But beneath the glamour, the air was thick with a sense of foreboding, an undercurrent I couldn't shake. The first signs of something amiss came during the third night at sea, as I polished the silverware for the evening's dinner. I overheard whispers among the crew rumors of strange occurrences in the lower decks. Some claimed to have seen a figure gliding through the corridors, shrouded in shadows, while others spoke of an eerie chill that settled over the ship at odd hours. I dismissed their fears as mere superstition. After all, we were on the Titanic, the unsinkable ship. But that night, as I prepared for my shift, I felt a tremor of doubt. Something was lurking, and it wasn't just the relentless waves outside. The dining room was alive with laughter and clinking glasses. But even amidst the revelry, I noticed a tension in the air. The passengers were oblivious to the growing unease among the crew. As I served champagne to an elderly couple from Philadelphia, I caught a glimpse of the ocean through the grand windows. It was no longer a shimmering expanse, but a dark, roiling abyss, as if it had come alive with malevolence. I felt an inexplicable urge to turn away, but curiosity held me captive. That night, the atmosphere grew heavier, and I could sense an unseen presence creeping through the ship. It was as though the Titanic itself was alive, breathing, waiting for something. I resolved to investigate the lower decks, an act of foolish bravery fueled by the need to prove to myself that I was not afraid. Little did I know, the ship was harboring secrets that would shatter my reality. As I descended the narrow staircase leading to the lower decks, the air turned frigid, wrapping around me like a vice. The dimly lit corridor stretched before me, like a tunnel into darkness, and with each step I felt my heart race. The environment, once a magnificent wonder, now felt like a living entity, pulsating with dread. I could hear the whispers again, echoing in the silence, a cacophony of voices, pleading for release, warning me to turn back. But I pressed on, driven by an insatiable need to uncover the truth. That's when I stumbled upon it, a door slightly ajar, a flickering light spilling into the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, the whispers growing louder, merging into a single cry. What lay beyond that door would change everything, casting a shadow over my survival and binding me to the souls lost beneath the waves. But when night fell, something inexplicable happened. I stood before that half-open door, heart pounding, a strange mix of dread and curiosity coursing through my veins. The whispers had transformed into a chorus of anguished cries, and the flickering light beckoned me closer. I pushed the door open, my fingers trembling, and stepped into the room beyond. Inside, the scene was surreal. A small candle flickered on a table cluttered with papers and personal belongings, items that seemed out of place aboard such a grand vessel. A worn, leather-bound journal lay open, its pages yellowed with age, filled with frantic scrolls. I could feel an energy pulsing in the air, a weight of emotion that pressed down on me like the ocean itself. It was as if the very essence of those who had been lost was contained within these walls. Barely able to process the chaos around me, I heard a voice behind me, low and urgent. "You shouldn't be here." I turned to find a young woman, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, eyes wide with fear. She wore a simple dress, starkly contrasting with the opulence surrounding us. "They're watching," she added, glancing nervously toward the shadows. "Who are you?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you know about this place?" "My name is Eliza," she replied, stepping closer, her expression a mix of defiance and despair. "I'm a stewardess, like you. They're not just spirits, there are things aboard this ship that no one can explain. We have to warn the others." "Warn them about what?" I asked, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "About the ship's curse," she said, her voice trembling. "They say the Titanic is a prison for the souls who perished in the icy depths. It keeps them here, trapped among the living. And now it wants more." A chill ran down my spine as I thought of the passengers upstairs, blissfully unaware of the terror lurking below. "You're telling me this ship is haunted?" Eliza nodded, her gaze intense. "Worse than that, the spirits are restless. I've seen things, Samuel. Shadows moving on their own. Voices calling out in the dark. We need to find a way to break the curse before it claims more lives." The weight of her words settled heavily on my shoulders. I had come seeking the truth, but now I was faced with a reality that felt impossible to grasp. "What do we do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Elisa took a deep breath. "We need to gather the crew. They need to know. We can't let them dismiss this as mere superstition. If we don't act, the Titanic will sink under the weight of its own sorrow." As we spoke, the whispers intensified, swirling around us like a tempest. I could feel the pull of the ocean, a dark force beckoning me to abandon reason and succumb to fear. But I couldn't turn away, not when lives were at stake. I glanced toward the door, the flickering light, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and nodded to Elisa, "Let's go." As we made our way back through the corridor, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, and the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of despair that threatened to drown out my thoughts. I could sense something sinister lurking just beyond the periphery of my vision, and with every step, the weight of the dead pressed down on my chest. We gathered a small group of crew members, 2 deckhands, a cook, and an elderly engineer named Mr. Thompson, who had worked on ships for decades. Their faces were a mix of skepticism and fear as Eliza recounted her experiences, but I could see a glimmer of belief spark in their eyes. We were united by a common goal, but as we formed our plan, I felt the burden of my own doubts creeping in. Would they take us seriously? Would they believe that a curse had come to life on this ship? I glanced at Eliza, who stood resolute, and for the first time, I saw a fire in her eyes, a determination that ignited something deep within me. As we prepared to confront the darkness that lurked in the ship's depths, I felt the pressure mounting, the boundaries of sanity blurred. Reality itself began to twist. We were racing against time, and with every passing moment, the Titanic's secrets threatened to consume us all. As we gathered in the dimly lit room, the atmosphere shifted once again. The whispers morphed into a low, haunting melody that wrapped around us like a shroud, and I could feel the hairs on my arms stand on end. Eliza's words had sparked a fire of urgency, but now doubt began to creep in. Was this truly a curse, or was I simply losing my grip on reality? The tension in the air thickened as I glanced at the crew members, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. Mr. Thompson, the elderly engineer, stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. I've worked on ships my entire life, and I've never encountered anything like this. But I've heard legends about the Titanic. They say she was doomed from the moment she was built. I always thought it was just a story to scare children. His voice trembled, and they could see the weight of his own memories pressing down on him. But what if it's true? What if this ship is indeed a prison? Before I could respond, the room grew colder. I shivered, feeling a presence behind me, a dark shadow that seemed to pulse with malevolence. I turned, but there was nothing there. Only the flickering candlelight. Did you feel that? I asked, my voice cracking. Eliza nodded, her eyes wide with fear. It's getting stronger. We need to hurry. But as we moved to exit the room, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. Panic surged through me. What's happening? I shouted, pounding on the door. Let us out. Then, suddenly, the shadows coalesced into a figure, a woman in a tattered white dress, her face pale and haunting. I recognized her from the stories I had heard. One of the passengers who had gone down with the ship. You shouldn't be here, she warned, her voice echoing with sorrow. You must leave while you can. Who are you? I asked, my heart racing. What do you want? I am one of the lost, she replied, her gaze piercing through me. And I bring a warning. The ship feeds on the despair of those aboard. It wants you to feel the weight of our sorrow, to join us in our eternal anguish. I stumbled back, my mind racing. The trauma of my past, the loss of my own family in a tragic accident suddenly surfaced, raw and painful. I had buried it deep, but now it clawed its way up, intertwining with the specter's words. Had the Titanic drawn me here to relive my own grief? Eliza reached for my arm, but I could see the fear in her eyes too. Samuel, we need to escape. This isn't just about the ship anymore, it's about all of us, our pasts, our regrets. It's trying to pull us into its darkness. The shadows thickened, pressing in on us like a vice, and I felt the weight of despair settling over me. I can't let it take me, I whispered, the realization crashing over me. It wasn't just the ship that was cursed. It was the very essence of loss that bound us all together. But as I turned to face my companions, I saw something in their eyes, something deeper than fear. Mr. Thompson, too, had a haunted look, as if memories long buried were surfacing. We all have our burdens, he said softly, but we can't let them define us. Just as I thought we might find clarity, the room plunged into darkness. The candles sputtered and extinguished, leaving us in a suffocating black. I felt a rush of icy air, and then silence. Then a single voice broke through the stillness, low and menacing. You cannot escape your fate. The weight of the situation crashed down on me, and I realized that the Titanic was not just a ship, it was a reflection of our own fears, our own pasts. I looked at Eliza, her fear mirrored in my own heart. The path ahead was dark, but we had no choice but to confront the shadows both within and around us. With a deep breath, I reached for Eliza's hand. We need to stick together. Whatever this is, we can face it as long as we're united. The room began to shimmer with a ghostly light, and I felt the pull of something ancient and powerful. The mystery was deeper than I'd ever imagined, and as we stood on the brink of the unknown, I knew we had to unravel the truth before it consumed us all. As I held Eliza's hand, the eerie glow enveloped us, casting elongated shadows on the walls that danced like specters. The voice echoed around us, the malevolence palpable. You cannot escape your fate. My heart raced. I could feel the weight of our collective sorrow pressing down, threatening to suffocate us. The vision of the ghostly woman lingered at the edge of my mind, her sorrow a heavy shroud. I turned to Mr. Thompson, who stood resolute, his past etched into the lines of his weathered face. We need to confront it, I said, my voice steadying despite the chaos. We cannot let it claim us, Samuel, Eliza whispered, her grip tightening. What if we're not strong enough? Then we fight together, I replied, remembering the strength that comes from shared burdens. We confront our own darkness, not just the ship's. Just then, a gust of wind whipped through the room, extinguishing the last remnants of light and plunging us back into darkness. I felt the cold tendrils of despair wrapping around me, threatening to drag me down into the abyss. But I couldn't let that happen, not again, Mr. Thompson, I shouted, my voice echoing in the void. Tell us your story. We need to break this cycle. At first, there was silence. I could hear Eliza's shallow breaths beside me, and then Mr. Thompson's voice broke through, shaky but determined. I lost my wife on this very ship. We were supposed to sail to a new life, but she was taken from me in an instant. His words trembled with the weight of his grief. I thought I could forget, but the pain, it never left me. Then let's remember together, I urged, desperation lacing my tone. We can't let the ship feed on our sorrow. We need to transform it into something stronger. The shadows shifted, swirling like a tempest, and I could feel the ship's hunger intensifying. Elisa squeezed my hand, and I could see the spark of determination in her eyes. I lost my brother in a storm at sea. I've carried that grief alone for too long, she confessed, her voice stronger now, but I won't let it define me. In that moment, I felt an electric charge in the air, as if our shared pain was creating a barrier against the darkness. The shadows hesitated, and I sensed a shift in the atmosphere. "We are not your prisoners," I shouted, my voice gaining strength. "We honor the lost by living fully." But the figure of the ghostly woman returned, her face twisted in anger. "You cannot escape," she screamed, the room vibrating with her fury. I took a step forward, fueled by the voices of my companions. "We choose to confront our pasts. We choose to break free." With that declaration, I felt a surge of energy, as if the very essence of the ship shifted beneath our feet. The shadows recoiled, their grip loosening ever so slightly. It was now or never. I could feel the decision weighing on me, the choice to either succumb to the despair or rise above it together. I yelled, and with a nod from Eliza and Mr. Thompson, we took a collective step toward the swirling abyss, ready to confront the malevolence that sought to claim us. The room exploded with light, and the shadows began to dissolve around us. Whatever awaited on the other side of this confrontation, I knew we were ready. But the true test was yet to come. As we surged forward into the blinding light, a cacophony of voices swirled around us, each one an echo of grief and loss. I felt the heat of the shadows searing my skin, but I pressed on, fueled by the unity forged between Eliza, Mr. Thompson, and me. The moment we collided with the light, a deafening silence enveloped us, and I braced myself for impact. When I opened my eyes, we stood on the deck of the ship, the sun shining brightly overhead. The shadows were gone, but I could still feel the remnants of their icy touch lingering on my skin, a reminder of what I had faced. Eliza was beside me, her eyes wide with disbelief, and Mr. Thompson stood a few feet away, looking both haunted and liberated. "We did it," I gasped, a mix of relief and exhaustion flooding my voice. But the moment was short-lived. I glanced back at the cabin where we had confronted the darkness, and the door slammed shut, as if sealing away the remnants of our battle. A chill ran down my spine, reminding me that we may have triumphed, but the war was far from over. Eliza stepped closer, her expression shifting from triumph to concern. "What just happened? Are we free?" "I think we've broken the hold," I replied, but my words felt hollow. The ship, while seemingly peaceful, still carried an air of melancholy. I could see it reflected in Mr. Thompson's eyes, as he gazed out at the horizon. "But there's more to uncover. I can feel it." His voice trembled as he spoke. "The spirits, they were not just lost, they were trapped, and we were part of their story." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. "Their pain is still here, echoing in the ship's very walls." As I turned back to Eliza, I noticed the faintest shimmer of light at the water's edge, a glimmer of something beneath the surface. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's not over? What if we've only just begun to uncover the truth?" Before I could respond, the ship jolted violently, throwing us to the ground. I felt a sharp pain in my side as I landed, the reminder of the scars I would carry. The wood beneath us creaked ominously, and I knew then that our confrontation had awakened something else, something that had been lying in wait. "Look," Mr. Thompson shouted, pointing toward the water. The shimmering light grew brighter, and I could see shapes forming just beneath the surface, undulating like restless spirits yearning for release. "We can't let it pull us back," I said, pushing myself to my feet despite the pain. "We need to understand what we've unleashed." Eliza and Mr. Thompson nodded, a newfound determination igniting in their eyes. We had survived, but the consequences of our confrontation had only just begun. As we moved closer to the edge, the air thickened with tension, and I realized we were still entangled in a web of mysteries. The ship might have been free from the immediate threat, but the echoes of the past were still very much alive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our journey was far from over. There were stories yet untold, and as I stared into the depths of the water, I knew we would have to dive back in together. "Let's find out what we've awakened," I said, my voice steady despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. And with that, we took our first step toward a new mystery. The shadows of the past still lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting to be unraveled. As I edged closer to the water's edge, I felt a magnetic pull, an inexplicable urge to plunge into the depths below. Eliza and Mr. Thompson flanked me, our breaths shallow as we stared at the shapes dancing beneath the surface, luminous and tantalizing. What were they? Could they be the spirits we had liberated? Or were they something darker, yearning to drag us back into the void we had barely escaped? "We need to make a choice," I murmured, feeling the tension crackle in the air. Do we dive into the unknown or stay on this ship, where we might be safe but forever haunted? Eliza's eyes bore into mine, a storm of emotion swirling within them. What if the answers we seek lie below? But what if we're just inviting more darkness? Mr. Thompson, his face pale, added, "Whatever we decide, it can't go unchallenged. The shadows will find a way to reclaim what we've disrupted." The shimmering light pulsed, beckoning us with an alluring glow. I could see reflections of lost faces, their mouths forming silent screams, their eyes pleading. A surge of dread coursed through me, but so did a fierce desire to understand. This was our chance to confront the mysteries that had haunted us. Together, I said, steeling myself. Whatever lies beneath, we face it as one. As we prepared to leap, the ship trembled beneath our feet, a warning in that moment. I was struck with an unsettling realization. Perhaps we were not the ones making the choice. Perhaps we were simply pawns in a game much larger than ourselves, drawn by forces beyond our comprehension. And as we plunged into the depths, the water enveloped us, the light fading into darkness. I couldn't tell where the shadows ended, and we began. And as I reached for Eliza's hand, I felt the weight of countless souls pressing against me, their fates intertwined with ours. What awaited us beneath the surface remained a mystery, one that would haunt us long after our bodies surfaced. Had we freed the spirits or merely unleashed a new darkness? The answers danced just out of reach, tantalizingly close yet forever elusive. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Share with your friends so they can also embark on this mystery-filled adventure. Leave a comment below telling us your favorite part or what kind of ending you'd like to see in a future story.
My name is Elizabeth Hartwell, and I have never told this story before. I survived the Titanic, but what I witnessed that cold night goes beyond what anyone could imagine. I met Isaac Brennan during the voyage. He was a strange man, with piercing eyes and calculated gestures. He worked as a steward in third class, but there was something different about him. His eyes were of such an intense blue that they seemed almost translucent. On the night of the sinking, as the ship began to go down, Isaac approached me in the dark corridors. His footsteps were silent, almost ethereal. "You need to know the truth," he whispered, gripping my arm with a supernatural strength. At that moment, panic set in. People were running in every direction, screams of terror echoing through the corridors. But Isaac seemed immune to the chaos, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that froze me completely. "We are not what we seem," he said, his voice a cold whisper cutting through the noise around us. His hands, once normal, began to change. His fingers elongated, and his nails became pointed like claws. My body trembled involuntarily as Isaac continued to stare at me. His eyes no longer appeared human. They were like two shards of bluish-green ice, almost translucent. "There are secrets on this ship that no one will ever uncover," he murmured, his icy breath touching my face. The smell was strange, something between brine and a metallic scent I couldn't identify. The screams around us seemed distant. The Titanic creaked, the wood splintering, the metal bending with horrible groans. But Isaac remained impassive, as if that destruction did not affect him. At that moment, I saw something impossible. His skin began to change texture, small greenish, scales emerging between the pores, almost imperceptible at first glance. My brain struggled to process that transformation. "We came before," he said. "Long before humans. The ocean belongs to us." A group of passengers rushed past, pushing us aside. Isaac did not move. He remained still like a living statue. His eyes continued to fixate on me, studying me as if I were a rare specimen. Isaac's transformation intensified. His human features slowly distorted, revealing something that could never be explained by science or reason. "We are the guardians of the abysses," he whispered, his voice now a guttural sound, almost like a snake's hiss mixed with the sound of breaking waves. The deck was chaotic. People were running, crying, praying. But Isaac? He seemed completely indifferent to the despair around us. His hands, now fully transformed, had webbing between the fingers, like those of an ancient marine being. I remembered sailors' tales of mythical creatures, legends of beings that inhabited the depths of the oceans. Isaac was not just a man. He was something more, something that transcended human understanding. "Many will die tonight," he said, "but some will be chosen." A shiver ran down my spine. His eyes now glowed with a light of their own, a blue so intense that it seemed to absorb the darkness around us. The Titanic creaked, splitting in two. The frigid waters of the North Atlantic began to swallow the ship. And Isaac? He smiled. A smile that was not human, revealing pointed teeth and a silent promise of something far beyond death. The waters were a freezing nightmare. Bodies floated. Screams mingled with the sound of debris. But Isaac, he was different. He did not feel the cold. He did not shiver like the others. "I will protect you," he murmured, but his tone was not one of comfort. It was a declaration, almost a sentence. I then realized that his skin was constantly changing. Sometimes it seemed human. Sometimes it had greenish reflections like marine scales. His hands pulled me close, keeping me near as the chaos of the sinking enveloped us. "Our people have been watching for millennia," Isaacs said. "You are just temporary passengers in this domain." I saw something incredible. Small creatures resembling him emerged from the dark waters. They were not human, nor were they entirely animal. Hybrid beings with luminous eyes that watched the sinking as if it were a ritual. The cold consumed me, but Isaac kept me strangely warm. His movements were fluid, unlike anything I had ever seen. He did not swim like a human. He glided through the water as if he were part of it. "Many will die," he repeated, "but some will be chosen to know the truth." Dawn revealed a scene of horror and mystery. The few rescued survivors looked like ghosts, but Isaac, he was different. When the rescue ships arrived, he simply vanished. He did not swim, did not dive. He simply dissolved into the dark waters as if he had never existed. In the following years, I obsessively investigated. I discovered ancient records from sailors that spoke of similar creatures, beings that inhabited the depths, observing humans as a sort of experiment. Isaac was not a man. He was something more. An ancestral guardian of the oceans, a creature that existed long before any human civilization. His words echoed in my mind. "You are just temporary passengers." In my nightmares, I saw his luminous eyes watching me, that supernatural blue that seemed to hold secrets of thousands of years. I knew he was alive, that he was watching me. Sometimes, decades later, when I looked out to sea, I felt his gaze. An invisible presence, but definitely present. The Titanic was just a chapter, a demonstration of power, a warning. After years of quiet investigation, I discovered secret documents that connected Isaac to an ancient lineage of marine beings. They were not just legends or mythology, they were carefully hidden historical records. At the Naval Museum in London, I found a diary of an officer that described creatures similar to Isaac in previous expeditions to the Titanic. Marginal notes spoke of guardians of the abyss, beings capable of metamorphosing between human and marine forms. Isaac belonged to an ancient underwater civilization. They were not just creatures, but a complex society that had been observing humanity for millennia. Their mission? To monitor our species and intervene when necessary. The sinking of the Titanic was not an accident. For them, it was a ritual, a way to demonstrate power and select the chosen, people with specific characteristics that could be useful for their kind. My survival was not by chance. Isaac marked me that night, something I only discovered years later when strange marks began to appear on my body, small translucent scales that emerged during the full moon. In 1935, I made contact with a group of hidden researchers studying inexplicable marine phenomena. They confirmed the existence of an underwater society that Isaac represented. They called this civilization the Deep Ones, beings that evolved long before humans, with technology and knowledge that transcends our understanding. Isaac was a kind of ambassador, responsible for observing and occasionally intervening in human events. Confidential documents showed that these creatures not only observed, but subtly manipulated historical events. The Titanic would be just one example of how they could influence human history. Physical characteristics of these beings: complete metamorphosis capability, adaptable breathing in water and land, telepathic communication, extreme longevity, centuries of life, blood with a chemical composition different from humans. Isaac had a specific mission that night. He was not just an observer, but a selector. He chose people with special genetic or mental potential for possible future interactions. My connection with him went beyond a simple encounter. I had been marked for something greater. The mark that Isaac left on me was not just physical, but a deep genetic connection. Small modifications in my DNA began to manifest years after. The sinking. I discovered that my blood had unique characteristics: accelerated regeneration capability, resistance to extreme temperatures, enhanced sensory perception, especially near large bodies of water. Secret researchers who were following me documented inexplicable changes. My hearing picked up underwater sounds imperceptible to normal humans. During the full moon, I developed a translucent membrane between my fingers. I could stay submerged for hours without needing to breathe. Isaac did not choose me by chance. I had a genetic predisposition that the deep ones had been seeking for generations. I was a kind of bridge between two species. In 1950, I had my first real telepathic contact with other marine beings. Fragmented images of submerged civilizations, technologies beyond human comprehension, silent invasions. My mission was to be an observer, a channel of communication between two realities. The deep ones were not just a civilization, but a complex intelligence system that existed long before humanity. Isaac was merely an agent, a messenger of a network of beings that controlled the oceans. I discovered that there were different hierarchical levels: observers like Isaac, territorial guardians, leaders manipulating global events, scientists studying the evolution of species. My transformation was part of a larger project. They were preparing me to be a communication channel, a bridge between worlds. Every change in my body was calculated. Each genetic alteration had a specific purpose. Secret documents. I was able to access revealed long-term plans, constant monitoring of human civilization, preparation for possible intervention scenarios, selection of individuals with adaptation potential. The marks on my body were not just physical. I now had a mental connection with the depths. I could sense ocean movements, foresee tsunamis, perceive climate changes before they happened. Isaac visited me occasionally, not physically, but through mental projections. He transmitted fragmented information about the future of humanity, about changes that were to come. The truth was more complex than anyone could imagine. We were not just being observed, we were part of a global experiment. In 1975, I received the final revelation. Isaac contacted me on a full moon night through a telepathic connection that transcended any human understanding. The truth was terrifying. The deep ones were not just observers, but architects of our reality. The Titanic was merely an experiment, a test to assess human resilience and select individuals with potential for evolution. I discovered that several historical catastrophes were orchestrated by them. Some shipwrecks, certain extreme climate events, subtle modifications in ecosystems. My final function would be to be a communication channel, not just to observe, but to prepare humanity for an inevitable transformation. The oceans hold secrets that humanity is not ready to comprehend. Entire civilizations exist in the depths. Technologies beyond human imagination are hidden in the abysses. Isaac revealed to me that in approximately 50 years, there would be a great transition event, a change that would completely alter human understanding of its own existence. My mission: to prepare the ground, leave traces, create bridges of understanding. On the night of March 15, 2025, something happened that defies all rational logic. I was in my apartment when I saw Isaac again. Not as a physical being, but as a translucent projection that passed through walls. His eyes were no longer blue, but a deep green that absorbed all the light around. "It's now," he said, without moving his lips. Suddenly, all the mirrors in the apartment began to liquefy. Not shatter, not crack, literally melting like wax, flowing in hypnotic movements. The water in the vases started to rise vertically, defying gravity. My body began to change. It was not pain, it was transformation. Membranes between my fingers expanded. My skin took on greenish reflections like marine scales. Isaac smiled, not a human smile, a smile that contained all the secrets of the oceans.
Of course, I will create a supernatural account of the Titanic before its sinking, focusing on the supernatural events involving people and workers who died during its construction. I will divide the story into parts, respecting the 5,000 character limit per chat. Here is the first part. Belfast, Northern Ireland, 1911. The Harland and Wolff shipyard was bustling with activity as the imposing RMS Titanic took shape. The ship that promised to be the largest and most luxurious in the world was nearing completion, but an ominous aura already hung over it. I, Thomas O'Brien, was a young apprentice carpenter, eager to be part of the team that built this floating wonder. Little did I know that my experience aboard the Titanic would be far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. It all began on a cold October morning. The sky was gray, and a thick fog enveloped the shipyard. I was working on the upper deck when I heard a muffled scream coming from somewhere below. I ran to the edge and saw a group of men gathered around, something on the ground. As I approached, my stomach dropped. It was the body of John Murphy, a veteran welder. Murphy had fallen from a scaffold, his head hitting a steel beam hard. The scene was horrific, and shock washed over us all. It was the first fatal accident I had witnessed while building the Titanic. But unfortunately, it would not be the last. Over the next few weeks, a series of strange incidents began to occur. Tools would mysteriously disappear, only to reappear in unlikely places. Lights would flicker inexplicably, and some workers swore they heard whispers coming from empty compartments. At first, we thought it was just the fatigue and stress of hard work playing tricks on our minds. But then something happened that we could not ignore. It was a particularly dark night, and I was working overtime, finishing work on one of the first-class suites. Suddenly, I felt a sharp chill run down my spine. The air around me grew heavy, and I had the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. When I turned, I saw a translucent figure standing in the doorway. My heart raced as I recognized the face. It was John Murphy. His eyes were blank, and a pained expression contorted his features. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. In a blink, the apparition was gone, leaving me shaking and confused. In the days that followed, I discovered that I was not alone in my experience. Other workers began reporting similar encounters. A painter swore he had seen the ghost of a young apprentice who had been crushed to death by a steel plate weeks earlier. A seamstress working on the interiors said she heard a child's cry coming from one of the lockers, only to find it empty when she opened it. The tension in the shipyard was palpable. Many workers refused to be alone in certain areas of the ship, especially at night. Some even quit, unable to cope with the constant fear. The supervisors tried to stifle the rumors, chalking it up to stress and overactive imaginations. But we knew the truth. The Titanic was becoming a magnet for the restless souls of those who had lost their lives in its construction. As the ship neared completion, the supernatural events intensified. One night, while working in the first-class dining room, I witnessed something I will never forget. The dining room was silent, lit only by a few work lamps. I was polishing the final details of the wood paneling when I heard the sound of footsteps echoing across the floor. Turning, I saw a procession of ethereal figures entering the room. They were the spirits of the workers who had died during the construction of the Titanic. Led by John Murphy, they moved silently, their eyes fixed on something I could not see. I recognized faces: the crushed young apprentice, an electrician who had died from electrocution, a painter who had fallen from a scaffold. Their translucent bodies glowed with a blue light, casting dancing shadows on the ornate walls. Paralyzed by fear and fascination, I watched as they sat at the tables, as if they were attending a macabre banquet. Murphy, the silent leader, raised a ghostly glass in a somber toast. It was then that I realized they were staging their own version of the inaugural dinner they would never get to experience. The air turned chilly, and I could see my breath forming clouds of steam. The spirits began to murmur to each other, their voices an unintelligible whisper that seemed to come from every direction. Suddenly, all heads turned toward me. Dozens of opaque eyes stared at me, and I felt as if they were looking right into my soul. Murphy stood up and started walking toward me. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. When he was only a few feet away, he opened his mouth to speak. The sound that came out was like the grinding of twisted metal, making my bones vibrate. "Be careful," he said, his voice a distant echo. "The ship, fate sealed. Many more will join us." Before I could process his words, a cold wind swept through the room, and in the blink of an eye, all the spirits were gone. I stood there, shivering, for several minutes before I found the strength to move. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had just been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But Murphy's words echoed in my mind, a dark omen that I couldn't ignore. As the Titanic neared its completion, the supernatural events seemed to diminish. Some workers speculated that the spirits had finally found peace. Others, like me, feared that this was just the calm before the storm. Launch day arrived, and Titanic was greeted with great pomp and circumstance. As the crowds cheered and the flags waved, I couldn't help but feel a knot in my stomach. Looking up at the mighty ship, I thought I saw for a moment familiar faces in the cabin windows, the faces of those who had died to build her. When Titanic set off on her test voyages, I decided I could no longer be a part of it. I resigned and left Belfast, carrying with me the weight of the secrets I had witnessed. Months later, when news of Titanic's sinking arrived, I was not surprised. Murphy's words came back to me with frightening clarity. The ship's fate had been sealed long before she encountered that fateful iceberg. In the years that followed, I heard stories from survivors who recounted strange experiences during her maiden voyage. Some spoke of mysterious voices echoing through the empty corridors, others of shadowy figures seen in the corners of cabins. One account in particular caught my attention. A first-class passenger swore that on the night of the sinking she had seen a procession of spectral figures led by a man who matched John Murphy's description. They walked calmly across the deck, oblivious to the chaos around them, as if they were guiding the souls of those who were about to join them. Today, decades after those events, I am still haunted by memories of what I saw on the Titanic. Sometimes, in my dreams, I find myself back in that dining room, surrounded by the spirits of those who died, and I always wake up with Murphy's words echoing in my ears. Many more will join us. The Titanic may be at the bottom of the ocean, but I am certain that the spirits that inhabited it are still there, trapped between our world and the next, an eternal testament to the tragedy that was destined to happen from the beginning. Years passed, and I tried to move on with my life. I moved to London, got married, and had children. But the memories of the Titanic and its ghosts never completely left me. Sometimes on dark, silent nights, I could swear I could hear the distant echo of those spectral voices. In 1955, almost half a century after the sinking, I received an unexpected letter. It was from a man named William Murdoch, who claimed to be the nephew of Officer William McMaster Murdoch, who had served and perished on the Titanic. Young Murdoch had been researching his uncle's story and had somehow learned about my experiences. during the building of the ship. Reluctantly, but feeling that perhaps it was time to share my story, I agreed to meet him. On a rainy autumn afternoon, we met in a small London cafe. William was a quiet, thoughtful man, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of a tragic family history. As I recounted my experiences, I watched William's face change from disbelief to fascination, and finally to grim understanding. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. O'Brien," he said, his voice low and trembling. "What you are about to hear may sound crazy, but I swear it is true. My uncle, in the days leading up to the Titanic's maiden voyage, wrote in his diary about experiences that were disturbing." William took a worn leather notebook from his pocket and opened it. The yellowed pages were filled with a tight, nervous handwriting. He began to read. "April 10th, 1912. Something is wrong with this ship. Last night, while on my watch, I saw a figure on the deck. I thought it was a passenger, but as I got closer, I realized I could see right through him. The man turned toward me, his face a mask of pain, before disappearing into thin air. I am reluctant to report this to the captain. They will think I have gone mad." My blood ran cold at the words. William continued. "April 11th, 1912. The visions are getting worse. I hear voices in the empty corridors, muffled screams coming from the hold. Today, I saw a group of spectral figures gathered in the first-class dining saloon. They seemed to be performing some kind of dark ceremony. One of them, a man with a horrific head wound, saw me and said, 'Brace yourselves. Fate cannot be changed.' I fear what this may mean." William closed the journal, his eyes meeting mine. The last entry is dated April 14th, hours before the sinking. My uncle wrote that he saw a procession of spirits walking calmly across the deck, led by a man who matches his description of John Murphy. We were silent for a long moment, the implications of those words hanging heavy between us. Finally, William spoke again. "Mr. O'Brien, I believe that what you and my uncle experienced was no coincidence. The Titanic was doomed from the start, marked by the souls of those who died to build her." In the years that followed that encounter, William and I stayed in touch, sharing our research and discoveries. We met others who had similar experiences, survivors of the sinking, family members of victims, even divers who explored the wreck in the decades that followed. All reported the same feeling, that the Titanic was not just a ship, but a portal between our world and the afterlife, a place where the living and the dead coexisted in a macabre dance of fate. Today, at 95, I am one of the last survivors of that era. As I write these words, I cannot help but think of all those spirits, the workers who died during construction, the passengers and crew who perished in the sinking. Do they still roam the underwater corridors of the Titanic? Or have they finally found peace? One thing I know for sure, the story of the Titanic is more than a tragedy at sea. It is a reminder that there are forces beyond our comprehension, that sometimes fate is sealed long before we realize it. And as the sun sets on the horizon, I cannot help but wonder, are the ghosts of the Titanic still there at the bottom of the Atlantic, waiting to tell their stories to whoever dares to listen? With these words, I end my story. May those who read it find in it not just a tale of terror, but a reminder of the fragility of life and the persistence of the human spirit, even in the face of the darkest of tragedies.